time when you're implementing RAID, what you're going to do is actually purchase a RAID controller card and install it in your system. Many servers come with the RAID controller built into the system, and you don't actually have to install a card. Others you will have to purchase the card and install it. However, that's not the only way to do it. You could also implement RAID using software. Most network operating systems support software RAID. In other words, instead of using a hardware card to manage the RAID array, we use the CPU in the operating system to create the RAID array. Software RAID works very well. It's really easy to implement. It's a lot less expensive because you don't have to go out and purchase any RAID card. However, it is slightly slower than using hardware RAID. With hardware RAID, we have a chip on the RAID card that's dedicated to doing nothing other than managing that RAID array. If we implement software RAID, then we have to use part of our CPU time to perform RAID operations instead of using the chip on the RAID card. Either way works. Given a choice, I would always go with hardware RAID over software RAID. Now with that in mind, we need to talk about RAID levels. Let's start with RAID 0. RAID 0 is just simple, plain old striping. We talked about striping before. We used this diagram. Well, RAID 0 is just that. It's striping data between two hard disk drives. As such, RAID 0 can dramatically increase the performance of I/O operations on your storage subsystem. It increases speed, but we talked about the disadvantages of striping. What were they? No redundancy, right? While RAID 0 can dramatically increase your throughput to and from the hard disk drive, it does not provide any redundancy. If this drive over here were to die, you've lost all the data on your system because your files are split between the two hard disks. We also have a RAID level called RAID 1. Before we go any farther, we do need to point out that many times folks who are new to RAID assume that the lower the number, the worse or less desirable the RAID level is, and the higher the number, the better the RAID level is, and that is not necessarily true. All this does is specify a certain way of configuring a RAID array. Depending on what you're trying to do, it might work great, it might not. So don't be confused. Don't assume that, say, a RAID 5 is better than a RAID 3, which is better than a RAID 1, which is better than a RAID 0. That's not the case. All it does is describe a certain way of implementing the hard drives in the array. If we're dealing with RAID 1, we're doing simple mirroring. As we talked about before, if you set up mirroring, you have two hard disk drives controlled by a single RAID controller. Whenever a write operation happens, the data is written to both hard drives in exact duplicate. If one drive were to die, the other drive can immediately take over and continue servicing clients. It provides redundancy. Fault tolerance does not increase the speed of the system. In addition to RAID 0 and 1, we can have RAID 5 arrays. We may have an array that looks like this. If you're going to set up a RAID 5 array, you have to have a minimum of 3 disks. You can have more in the array if you want to, but you do have to have a minimum of 3 disks. What we do is we stripe across all 3 of the disks, which does dramatically increase performance, but we reserve one portion of each disk for parity information. RAID 5 works really well. However, it does have some weaknesses. One of the weaknesses with RAID 5 is that if you do have a failure, if one of the disks goes down, we do have parity information that can keep the array running, but performance is really lousy. If a disk fails, yes, we can still access our files, we can still open, save, do whatever it is we need to do, but the performance is really, really bad. There are many other RAID levels other than those we talked about here. These are the ones you have to know. It's quite interesting. If you want to go out on the internet and search for RAID, you can find many different web pages that will describe the various RAID levels. There's RAID 2, and RAID 6, and RAID 7, and so on. And you can see how these